If you are a California homeowner, you may be wondering how the recent doubling of your city's housing production targets may impact your neighborhood zoning. The target is called the Regional Housing Need Allocation, or RHNA, pronounced RHNA. In this video, Gab Layton of the Embarcadero Institute discusses why the doubling of the housing need estimate occurred. She questions the idea that the policy of a supersized RHNA is going to be effective in producing more affordable housing, in reducing homelessness, in reducing socioeconomic inequity, and in mitigating climate change. It won't help, she says. Layton explains how Senator Scott Wiener's state law, SB 828, has been seemingly misinterpreted by state agencies like the DOF, Department of Finance, and the HCD, Housing and Community Development. Layton labels the new RHNA numbers a flawed double counting of the housing need, specifically a double count of households with overcrowding and cost burdens. Although the double counting, initiated by Senator Wiener's SB 828, may be perfectly legal, she argues it is very bad housing policy. She explains that in 2010, the state closed the redevelopment agencies, the RDAs, and ended its annual $3 billion of investment in BMRs, that is, investment in affordable, below-market rate housing. The cities have no tax funding themselves for BMRs. According to Layton, inclusionary zoning laws just make the affordable housing situation worse. As more and more market rate and luxury units are built, with even 20% BMR units included, that just increases the cost of BMR units, she argues. That is because the Bay Area and other metros have greenbelt laws preventing further sprawl. As housing density in a fixed region increases, rents rise, she says. In a land scarcity area like the peninsula, the fixed supply of land gets more expensive. On the other hand, in mid-sized metros like Las Vegas or Sacramento, they can still build and sprawl onto undeveloped land and grow fast and keep housing prices lower. She explains how the new HCD RHNA model seems to deviate from best practices of other housing experts like the Federal Housing Loan Agency, Freddie Mac, as well as Harvard. Without further ado, let's listen to Gab.
I mentioned I'm president of the Embarcadero Institute. I also live in Palo Alto, but as you may hear, I'm previously from Australia. My background and education is I have an undergraduate degree in mechanical engineering and a PhD in aerospace engineering. I worked in scramjet engine research for a while, and then worked at McKinsey and Company, and then following that, I went to work at an internet startup. I also serve on the executive committee of the board, the Stanford's Institute of Economic Policy Research. And unrelated to this, I'm also on the board of the Damon Runyon Cancer Research Foundation. But how the Embarcadero Institute came to be is that another fellow Palo Altan, Asher Waldfogel, who also comes from an analytical perspective, and I were noticing about 5 years ago that a lot of policy decisions were being made without the relevant data. And at the same time, we noticed that there was an abundance of government data that was being underutilized. So, the idea was to link those two ideas and provide data that would help policy decision makers make better decisions. That was the whole purpose and goal of the Embarcadero Institute. It started actually, one of the original ideas that we investigated was around vehicle ownership, because there was a lot of talk about the fact that people weren't buying cars anymore and that we'd hit peak car. And we got some data from the DMV to show that in the Bay Area and in other parts of California, car ownership has not peaked. And in fact, it's still increasing. The number of cars per household is still increasing, which is counter to what people think generally and have been told, but we think that sort of data is really important to factor in when people are making decisions around transportation and housing. Just thinking that we actually more recently focused, there were two reports that have actually received a lot of attention. One was about the RHNA numbers. The other one was about the McKinsey number. As I said, I worked at McKinsey, so I have a lot of respect for the firm. And when that report was released, it triggered some thinking because the number was so large, 3.5 million, which was the number they were claiming was the housing shortage, on a base of 14 million it just seemed worth exploring because it just seems almost implausible. So we looked at that pack and the analysis behind it and showed sort of the thinking and why it might be flawed. And then we dived in separately to the RHNA reports, which I'm going to present today. In terms of financing, because that often comes up a lot, how we're financed. There's about 5 individuals who contribute to the financing of the Embarcadero Institute. I'm one of them, so is Asha. We give of our time freely. No one on the board is paid, and we don't have any full-time employees. We do contract with some urban planners, architects, and some data scientists, but no one's full-time. And our budget last year was about 100,000. So I think that probably sums us up. And now I probably, if I can share the report, I'll explain our research to date. Do I have the ability to, oh yes, I do, share screen. Okay, so the reason why this matters, why this why I'm going to call it an exaggeration of the RHNA numbers matters, is because it adversely affects affordable housing. That's the big takeaway that we had from the study that we did. And just to give you some perspective before I dive into the rest of the work, this is the third, fourth, 5th, and 6th cycle. So this chart here, this bar here, is the most recent RHNA numbers. And this is for the 4 major urban areas in California: Southern California, San Diego, Sacramento, and the Bay Area. They're all represented here. But you can see the significant jump in the assessment this time around. These are, as I said, for the previous cycles. This 5th cycle, the most recent cycle we went through, the numbers were, the targets were a little lower, but that's mainly because we were experiencing the Great Recession at the time that the forecasts were made. And so we had a high vacancy rate. So that impacted how they thought about how much housing we would need. But this significant jump inspired our recent analysis. And this, so everybody understands, there are, several steps in the RHNA process. And some people get confused because they think we're talking about this part down here, which is when SCAG and ABAG and SANDAG develop their estimates for the individual cities. But we're actually focused on this up here, this stage here, which is where the HCD determines what the overall targets are for these planning organizations. And I think one of the most important things to understand is there are 2 components to figuring out what our housing needs are. Part of it is establishing what the existing need is, and then there's future demand. Future demand is pretty straightforward because it's about the Department of Finance develops these population projections. And so we understand how much the population is going to grow. And then they sort of decide, they use these optimal household formation rates to determine how many households those people will need. Then they add on a little healthy vacancy buffer, and that's the future demand. It's the existing need where the biggest discrepancy lies in these models. And how they decide on the existing need is that there's two factors. They realize that they need to have a target number of households and a target vacancy rate for the market to function, not perfectly, but function efficiently. And so they compare the current vacancy rate that exists with their benchmark vacancy rates. And if it's too low, then they add in housing. They said we need more houses to create a healthy vacancy rate. And if it's too high, as was in the case back in 2010 when they were making the assessments for the 5th cycle, theoretically, they would adjust the numbers down. They adjusted them a little bit down last time, but because they thought that was an anomaly, they didn't do a full discounting. But that vacancy rate is very important to understanding how the market's functioning. And then also they looked at how our household formation's going, like how many households exist and how many do they think would exist under normal conditions. So this is how they figure out existing need. And then they add, this is the missing households, future demand, the vacancy adjustment, and there's one final adjustment that's made, which is a replacement adjustment. It tends to be pretty small, but they look at a 10-year average and see how many households, how many houses were like being in the process of being refurbished or somehow offline replaced in some way during that period. And then they add some adjustment for that. This is a pretty standard approach to developing these assessments. And this is the outcome. So what's different? Actually, I'm just going to go back and explain one thing here. This household formation rate says like that's what should be what should be happening, and what we see on the ground is really the area where there is most disagreement between the models. So in this chart, I've grouped these columns, like and I'll focus on the Greater Bay Area because that's where everybody's from here. This column here is the 6th cycle assessment, and this is using the model that the HCD had previously used in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th cycle. Using that model, what they would have come up with. So this is something I need to clarify as well, because there's been a lot of misunderstanding about this. This is not the Embarcadero Institute's model. We didn't develop a model. This is the model that was previously used by the HCD, and this is their new model. And what's new about their model is, in addition to the household formation adjustment, they added in a second counting for overcrowding and cost burdening. And so that is the lion's share of the difference. There was a vacancy rate adjustment error, but it's much smaller. This is the lion's share of the difference. And the Bay Area and Southern California were most impacted by this. Southern California specifically was dealt a very difficult hand in this most recent cycle. And this is how the discrepancy really resulted, because when SB 828 as a bill that was passed in 2008 and became law, it had some wording that caused HCD to adopt a different methodology. And in the past, they had separated the types of housing. They'd said, okay, we should treat owner-occupied housing differently to rental housing. And the reason why those two groups of housing are treated differently is because they tend to have different vacancy rates. Rental housing tends to have a higher healthy vacancy rate than owner-occupied housing. If you look at this and this graph here, this is actually from the US Census, this graph, but this is vacancy rates for homeowners. So this is the owner-occupied vacancy rate. And you can see the long-term sort of average is about 1.5%. At the time of the Great Recession, it peaked at just around 3%. The benchmark that was applied to the data, the HCD 6 cycle, was 5%, because that is actually the normal healthy vacancy rate for rental housing, but they applied it across all housing types, which they hadn't done in the past, and is unusual because it's not just, this methodology is not just used by the HCD, it's also, there's a group out of Harvard, the Joint Center for Housing Studies, and they work on these same models as well, and this idea of target households, target vacancies, and what's target vacancy for owner-occupied versus rental housing. General sort of thinking is 1.5% for owner-occupied housing. The healthy rental vacancy sometimes varies. There is more variation in that, but it's typically like around 5% is the average. Sometimes it's a little lower, sometimes it's a little higher. So that's the error that was introduced in terms of vacancies. Then the error that was introduced in terms of household projections, overcrowding, and cost burning came about because the Department of Finance actually gives the HCD the number of households they think we're going to have to accommodate going forward. And they convened an expert panel back in 2015 because they noticed this is a long-term trend for household projections. And you can see what they call the headship rate, which is the rate of households and the number of households being formed per age cohort. And you can see these are all trending downwards, actually. And that has been a long-term trend. But they saw this sharper decrease from 2010 onwards as not being part of any sort of norm, but being more related to the Great Recession. And that it came about because if under that sort of economic stress, younger people were not starting out on their own to create households. They were staying at home longer. Families were doubling up, which is the factor, obviously, overcrowding. And so they made an adjustment. They said, this is not a norm, so we're not going to include this as a trend in housing. We're actually going to benchmark ourselves around the earlier 2000 period. So they actually did the average of 2000 and 2010 in terms of headship rates, because the general thinking, and this is not just the Department of Finance in California, this is also, as again, the Joint Center for Housing Studies out of Harvard, say that there is this longer term trend of decreasing household formation. So they wanted to recognize that, they shouldn't be benchmarking back here, but they decided to benchmark in this period here. But they had done that, which effectively accounted for overcrowding and cost burdening, because it's saying, we see that this is happening. This is not normal. What should we really expect? We'll take the overcrowding and the cost burdening out of the equation. What should we expect? But SB 828 specifically said that all the planning organizations had to submit numbers for overcrowding and cost burdening in their area, and that the HCD should factor that in. They didn't say exactly how they should factor it in, but they said that they should take that into account. So they made a second adjustment to the numbers that had already been adjusted by another state department. The reason why this matters is because you develop these really inflated numbers, but the thing that it impacts most of all is affordable housing, because it masks the real problem we have with housing. Here is the Bay Area, and you can see this is the third, fourth, and fifth cycle. We haven't actually quite finished the fifth cycle. So these numbers are prorated for what we would do based on our current performance. And because we're only a year or two away from completing, you can see that this part, this fourth cycle was impacted again by the Great Recession. So we didn't overproduce market rate housing as we had in the past, but we still achieved our market rate targets even despite the recession. But you can see here that we are overachieving by a significant percentage, like more than double our market rate housing. So cities are having no trouble producing housing at the market rate level, but this is how we're doing on our affordable housing. And you can see, our performance is getting worse because this was affected by the Great Recession. You can see this bump up in market rate, but affordable housing saw nothing like it. It's actually, our performance is becoming worse and worse. And one of the problems is going to be is that if our market rate targets are also double, which is what's happened, it will be the first thing that gets built, because what happens is if we don't build to our quotas, SB 35 kicks in, and SB 35 provides a streamlined approval process, which was meant to be for affordable housing. But now, because we won't necessarily achieve our market rate housing targets either, market rate housing will now be eligible for the streamlined processing. I think it calls out in SB 35, it calls out 10 units and under of market rate housing. So it won't be like any sort of massive housing development that is luxury or market rate that would get that streamlined approval, but anything that's 10 units and under would get that approval, and it wouldn't necessarily have to have any affordable housing at all. And the issue is this. This is how, in terms of visuals, the market is sitting here. And this is obviously simplified because there are actually multiple levels in market rate housing. But let's assume that the high-end luxury and general market rate are grouped together. It functions like a typical supply and demand curve. So when there's enough demand, the supply will meet the demand. And at some point, the market will be saturated and it won't necessarily build. There's places down here in the Bay Area, I think in Cupertino, where, there isn't, some of the developers have stepped away from building market rate housing because there's not enough money in it for them. So cities do not have any control over this whatsoever. So despite the fact that the state sets these housing targets, we can't force developers to build. So this exists and it's been functioning perfectly fine. And it's been fortunate because it has actually, we've met our targets. As you can see, we've exceeded our targets without trying. It's this area, the below market housing, that doesn't function in the market. We need funding to get this to move up into the housing, the real market, to participate in this market here. At the moment, the cities use tools like inclusionary zoning, public land donation, rely on some state funding, some local funding, tax credits, all those factors, tools sort of help us get to the affordable housing that we can. But it's actually limited because cities don't have the funding. There's limited state funding for affordable housing. So we rely on inclusionary zoning, which normally says, okay, 20%, if you include 20% affordable housing, you can build, we'll give you higher density. So not surprisingly, that's about how much affordable housing we create, 20% of our targets. And what's difficult, going to make things even more complicated for affordable housing is that this graph is from the economics of residential location. And it shows that as density increases, not surprisingly, rent and costs increase as well. So the more market rate housing we add, the more expensive it becomes to add affordable housing, especially with like land scarcity in places like the peninsula. And this, in a nutshell, is a real problem because the state sets us these targets that 60% of our housing targets are affordable housing, but this is what happens. So the residents, we send all our personal income tax goes to the state, property taxes get split up. A very small percentage of the property taxes comes back to cities. And that's essentially the largest source of funding for many cities. There's some sales tax as well, but a lot of them really depend on their property taxes. And they don't have any sort of dedicated funding source for affordable housing. This is the amount of taxpayers' money that comes back to cities for affordable housing. It's like a drop in the ocean. So while the state mandates these targets, they don't create any reality or practical purpose for them because they don't supply cities with the tools or the funding to make it happen. And just so everybody remembers, this is what happened to state funding for affordable housing. We were at like the $2.5 billion level, and then redevelopment agencies were shuttered, and funding for affordable housing collapsed. We have some one-off HEAP funding, which brought us up to $1.3 billion last year, but that's not a dedicated stream. So it's likely to collapse again. And that's important to keep in mind because here's the fifth cycle. These numbers actually are not just for the Bay Area. This is for the 4 regions that I mentioned before. State mandated targets. The light green is the very low and low income affordable housing that we're talking about. This is our likely production by the end of the cycle. As I said, this is for all 4 regions. The Bay Area is doing better on this front than some of the other regions. But you can see we've overachieved once again, market rate, very much underachieving on very low and low income. The difference in what we were supposed to build in terms of low income and what we're going to build, we're going to create about 350,000, we're going to be short 350,000 housing units, affordable housing units. And that in terms at an estimate of about 600,000 per housing unit, which in some cases is actually less than, I think there's some areas in the Bay Area where they estimated 700,000 a unit, but we worked on 600,000. That works out about $26 billion per year that we need. So it's like $210 billion that would be over in total to build all that housing that we're going to be short. But if we're building it over an 8-year cycle, that would be $26 billion a year. As I said, going back to this is how much the state has given us, 1.3. So we are short by a lot of money, and there's no way we can zone our way into these sorts of numbers. Zoning, like the zoning rules, and also the other sort of density bonus, etc., that for inclusionary zoning, get us this little slither here. So we've been unsuccessful here. Now this is our these are the challenges next time around. And you can see that our affordable housing target is larger than our market rate housing targets last time, and actually larger than the amount of housing we actually produced. Okay, and so in case you didn't realize that we had an affordable housing crisis, it's not just a general housing crisis. I think cities have no trouble permitting market rate housing. They've shown that they've exceeded their targets, and that shows up in this, jobs to housing ratio. The American Planning Association says the healthy range is between 1.3 and 1.7. We're spot on. We're at 1.4 in the Bay Area, which is great. But when you look at, if you dissect that and look at, okay, so we're great on the overall number, but what does it look like for affordable housing? How many affordable homes do we have for our minimum wage workers? Because 60%, of our workforce roughly is minimum wage workers. And that actually is what the state estimates, because 60% of the housing production they're saying should be affordable housing. That's intuitively makes sense when you see what our worker profile looks like. But this is how much we're short. In this case, we assume that for an affordable home, you have 2 workers in every affordable home. So that this is our ratio. We should be at 2, where everyone's over. San Francisco is closest to par, and that's partly because San Francisco is not just a city, it's a county as well. So they are fortunate in the sense that they keep more of their property taxes. So they have been better at building affordable housing than many of the other counties. But so this says that we are short 150,000 this is the Bay Area. In the Bay Area alone, we're short 150,000 affordable housing units, at least. Okay, and then this shows you that, once again, as I said, the state is expecting us essentially to build 1 affordable home for every 1 market rate is supposed to be equate to 1 affordable home. So for every 1 market rate, we're supposed to be building 1 affordable home. What's really happening is, most recently, we've been building 7 market rate homes for every 1 affordable. We used to be building 4 to 1, and it's gotten worse. And part of that is some of the bills have actually, from an inclusionary zoning point of view, have hurt us. Like there was one that just went through last year that I can't remember the number of the bill, but it's actually, on the surface, it seemed like it was helping affordable, but it's actually worse in the ratio. Like for a little bit more affordable, we get a lot more market rate. So it's not helping our efforts at all. And then the other challenge we face is, apart from the fact that we don't control the market, we seem to have a limit on how much housing we can produce. This number here, 2005, is the maximum the state produced back in, that's 205,000, and that happened around 2005. And this lower number here is for the 4 regions. So it's not for the state, it's for those 4 regions. And as a peak, we also peaked around 154,000 back in 2005. That was our peak housing production in the last 3 decades. And this is what we'd have to produce based on these different methodologies. This is the former HCD approach. This is the new HD approach. And this is Freddie Mac. I haven't mentioned anything about Freddie Mac, but Freddie Mac produced an estimate of how much housing is needed in California as well. Their estimates would put us at this level, very close to the former HCD approach. But you can see that this new HCD requirement, we'd have to almost double our housing production. And this shows the challenge that we're going to have in doubling our housing production, because as places become more dense, they grow more slowly. So it's probably easier to kick up housing production, like Sacramento is over here, and they probably have a better chance of doubling their housing production, and Bakersfield and Riverside. But San Francisco, Oakland, Fremont, Los Angeles, San Diego, we're all down in this area here. It's going to be very hard to move that lever. And I guess in summary, the biggest challenge, the reason why this matters is it's not just a tit for tat, and it's not people saying we don't want housing. We really need housing, but what we're most concerned with is getting the right type of housing, because if the aim is to reduce socioeconomic inequity and to help with the climate change goals, we really need to get the right housing for our workforce, and that is affordable housing. And if we need to prioritize it this cycle, and we need to, fund it like it is actually meaningful. Otherwise, we are just going to be digging ourselves into a bigger hole. Yes, some of these targets and the threat of, punishment from the state might cause cities to, add in some other density bonuses or whatever to market rate housing. But that it's only going to get us so far, because the market will produce what the market's going to produce. And it will have the net effect of making affordable housing more expensive and less likely to be built. If you want to read more about our reports, we're at the Embarcadero Institute.com. They're all listed. Okay, well, I'll address the first question, which is about Freddie Mac, because that was interesting, because Freddie Mac was doing an analysis of the state of the US market in terms of housing vacancies. Oh, sorry, housing need. And I can't remember the overall number for existing housing shortage across the country, but I think it was something like 2.3 million. It was interesting because they estimated that the housing shortage across the entire country was less than the housing shortage that McKinsey had estimated for California. But they took a different approach, a slightly different approach, because they still use the same idea about target households and target vacancies, but they used a different benchmark for household vacancies. They did the average, the HCD did the average of 2000 and 2010. They took the average from 1970 to 2000. So their benchmark is further back on that chart of household formation rates. And then instead of looking at there's several different types of vacancy, when you get down to housing households, it's owner occupied and rental housing, but there's also this gross vacancy level that's applied to all housing. And they took that approach because there's it's a different approach, but it's also interesting because despite taking a slightly different approach, they ended up with a very similar number. And I think it really confirms the fact that the original HCD methodology was based in some logical, rational argument. So that's in terms of the Freddie Mac approach. And to be clear, their estimates were for existing need. Remember, I talked about this existing need and projected households. When we compared, we did actually, as part of our, one of our other reports that hasn't yet been published, we did compare those models to be able to compare apples to apples. We took their same benchmarks that they used for target vacancy and target households and used it on the future housing, future households, like future population. So we used the DOF population projections, but used the Freddie Mac benchmarks. But, much more similar number to the old HCD approach than the new approach. The new approach is around a double both the old HCD and the Freddie Mac approach. A lot of consistency there. In terms of speaking to HCD and DOF at the time of the building the report. I had the chance to speak to Dr. Walter Schramm, who is the chief economist at the DOF, and he very kindly walked me through their assumptions in their model and talked about it. He was very helpful and knowledgeable. And then I also separately spoke to Tom Brinkius, who was a policy director, or is a policy director, I think, at the HCD. And he made it very clear that they were making, everything that they'd implemented was on the basis of SB 828. So, and I think I also heard Gustavo Velasquez, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. He's the new director of HCD. I heard him in an interview back in December or November, and with someone from Spur, and he described them. I think they'd obviously seen the work that we had created, and he was very clear to say that they were following the legislation. They were implementing it as they saw it required. What's interesting to me is that I think that it did mention applying a 5% vacancy rate, and it wasn't specific, but it didn't say you had to apply that to owner-occupied. It just it specifically mentioned rental vacancy rates at 5%. So there's that, and it did actually mention that the groups, the planning organizations, had to send in their benchmark numbers for these overcrowding and cost burdening, but they didn't say they had to apply it in a certain way, or they didn't say they had to apply it at all. For example, the HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the federal department, they use cost burdening to understand how they allocate affordable housing dollars. And it would make more sense to me to actually use those numbers to think about, okay, here's the housing that we need. How much of it is affordable versus market rate, and use it to sort of back up their percentages, how they decide. I think that would make a lot more sense. And also in terms of dollars funding allocation. So, so I hope I answered your question. I think as the people at HCD, they would say they were implementing the legislation. The vacancy rate is separate. So if you think about it, those two, the overcrowding and cost burdening, factor into figuring out how many households would be the benchmark for the target number of households that we need to have everybody comfortably housed. And then we also, on top of that, always need some sort of vacancy rate so the market can function efficiently. So there's always enough housing that's vacant on the market, so it creates a healthy transition. So the vacancy rate error applied to that buffer, in that they made an assumption about owner-occupied housing, and so it became higher than it normally would. But it's a smaller error than the double counting of the overcrowding and cost burdening, which is like into the actual number of households we should have. I mean, interestingly, if you take the numbers that, because as I said, that's also, it really is all in the existing, because they're sort of saying, what do these numbers tell us about the pressure on the housing market at the moment? And so the estimate of existing housing need was very, very different. If you plug those numbers back in to look at what they would mean, you know, I showed that the Bay Area currently has a healthy job housing ratio of 1.4. That means we have 1.4 jobs for every housing unit. If we added in the existing housing loss that the HCD new methodology estimate, it plunges us down to like ratios like 1.1, which that means for every house we would have 1.1 job. And we haven't seen numbers like that other than during the Great Recession, where we had a lot of unemployment, or back in the 80s when there was just women hadn't entered the workforce in greater numbers. So it's hard to imagine that number is healthy. It's difficult to get that data. I've actually been talking to a number of people, and we're thinking about initiating a big effort on that front, but it's going to be a very granular effort, because to actually, you know, there's databases at a city level that show how many permits have been approved, and then sort of then it's sort of, you can also find out sort of when they're approved from the city level and when they're in process. But it's hard to figure out the delay. I think there is information out there and we're planning to track it down, but I think you're highlighting an incredible point, because that it's back to this idea that cities don't have any control over the market. And so even if they permit the housing, it doesn't mean that it's going to be built in any particular time frame. And I think that in a nutshell is the real challenge for us here. And I think some of the legislation too gives them a bigger, wider buffer, that they can get a permit, but then hang on to it for 3 years. But then if you look at how SB 35 is going to kick in, it's going to be assessed halfway through or even earlier through the process, through the next cycle. So, you could have a situation where someone's sitting on land they've acquired for the purpose of, getting these permits done, or else they're sitting on permits and not having built the housing. I think also things like SB 35 create an incentive to land bank in a way, because if you, particularly for market rate housing now with these, double targets, if you sit on it long enough and waiting for a city to fail, if no one comes forward to push to want to develop housing, a city will automatically fail. You wait till they fail and then you get fast track approval. I mean, there's all these sort of unintended consequences of creating an incentive system like that. But Cindy, you're right on. I'm hoping that we will be able to get that data. I think they're the sort of issues that the legislative body should be working for. We should actually figure out a way to get cities more funding to build the affordable housing. We should create sort of incentives to get the housing production underway. And I think the other thing that's very difficult for affordable housing is the financing structures. They need to sort of figure out a way to streamline things so it's not as difficult for affordable housing efforts to find the financing. It seems like, there's so many different bodies that have to come together for these projects to take place. And then there's all these legal, legal efforts to help it as well. Everyone's got a lawyer to make sure the contracts are in place. It's difficult and expensive. And if we could streamline that, that would make a big difference, I think. Those numbers, how they to get to those numbers, they use benchmarks for those numbers as well. It's interesting you bring that up, because that's another issue all on its own. They use different benchmarks for different regions. And so the Bay Area relative to Southern California was fortunate in the sense that they benchmarked the Bay Area against 7 large metros. And Los Angeles got benchmarked against national norms, which, if you think about the national norm, that's urban and rural areas as well. The idea of benchmarking one of the most dense regions in the country, because Los Angeles, I think, is either the densest, I think it is actually the larger Los Angeles urban area, or else it's the second most dense. But the idea of benchmarking that area against national norms, it doesn't seem realistic. But so they looked at what's the cost, but for the Bay Area specifically, they looked at what's the cost burdening like in the 7 regions, the 7 major urban regions, and how do we compare? And then they looked at overcrowding for the 7 major regions, and they said, how do we compare with that as well? And so to start with overcrowding, what they said was the metric for overcrowding is if you have more than 1 person per room. That's not 1 person per bedroom, it's 1 person per room. And the median size house has 5 rooms. They don't count bathrooms, but it's kitchen and living room, etc. If you have more than 1 person per room. And they said for every house over the benchmark that was overcrowded, we would add another house to our number. But the issue is, in a way, if you were going to do it that way, if you have an overcrowded house, you might be overcrowded by 1 person that will put you over. So if you have, you shouldn't be doing it on the number of homes that are overcrowded, because one person is not necessarily going to equate to another additional house. It's actually should be the number of people who are in overcrowded conditions above the benchmark, and then figure out how many housing units they would need. But they did it a different way. They also applied that overcrowding adjustment, not just to existing housing, but also to future housing, which didn't make any sense to me, because surely the whole point of estimating these numbers would be to correct the overcrowding. So we shouldn't be experiencing that in future housing. And we don't, like the condition exists today, it doesn't in the future. And then even more unusually, they applied cost burdening only to future housing and not to existing housing. And honestly, when I spoke to the director, the policy director at the HCD at the time, because I was trying to understand why they did that, he explained that in a way they realized that it was a double counting of overcrowding, because there's separately, like, are you double counting with the DOF number? But by accounting for overcrowding and cost burdening, they're all interrelated factors, so that they recognized that it was going to be problematic to do that for existing households, because that's where the bulk of the housing is. And so they only applied it to future housing. But logically, that doesn't make any sense. But there's that piece of the puzzle. There's also the idea that different benchmarks were used for different regions. Bay Area got the 7 metros, Los Angeles, the LA area, and San Diego, I think, they were benchmarked against the national norm. Sacramento was benchmarked against 7 mid-sized metros, which made sense for Sacramento. And then I think San Diego, for example, didn't get any cost burdening adjustment, even though they're more cost burdened than the Bay Area. There were all sorts of different anomalies that came up in the way they handled it. But I addressed that in the pack, but I didn't go into it in detail in this presentation because it seems down in the weeds. But over and above the error at the high level, there's smaller errors in the approach, I think.
To conclude your presentation, could you address maybe some of the more frequent criticisms of the analysis, which is that, focusing on the methodology number itself, some would say might miss the bigger point. There is an argument that I've heard that given the fact that we are short on housing, as exemplified by our homeless encampments and lack of affordability, shouldn't we just build more? So can you address shouldn't we just build more, because the law of supply and demand would dictate that the more we build, the lower the costs? Could you just talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think we saw on those curves that the more you build does not necessarily lower the cost. If in a constrained area, we all have these urban growth boundaries where we can't move beyond. So we are defined where we're going to put the housing. So we're not adding housing and adding sprawl, we're adding housing and adding density. If you look at the curve, the more dense you become, the more expensive it becomes. So you're not going to build to affordability on that basis. You can build more market rate on that basis, and the market rate housing will become more expensive, but you are never going to serve that 60% of the housing need by just this approach. I mean, this is the reason why we care, is because I don't believe that is the solution, just to build more housing. It's important to understand what type of housing you need, and there are different strategies for affordable housing than just market rate housing. If we needed to boost market rate housing, yes, it would make sense. Some of these strategies would say, yes, let's do that. And I think the idea is we build more housing, and then eventually that housing becomes affordable. But the whole idea of trickle-down economics. But as you can see, you become more dense, the land price has to go up. So housing automatically becomes more expensive, rent becomes more expensive. It seems illogical to assume that it's eventually we're going to build our way to affordability because of these urban growth boundaries, because we're confined. We have a scarce resource. Do you know what I mean? That which is land, and it's becoming more and more expensive as we build. So I think that the counter to that is we can't build our way to affordability. That seems very clear now. And if you look at the market, how it's behaving based on past production, we're not building affordable housing other than the little bit of inclusionary zoning piece that we have. And I think it's dangerous to take that approach, because I think we're actually just digging ourselves into a bigger hole. I think that when you think about that market rate curve that I show you, you have the market rate housing, and then you have, I mean, it's called below market rate for a reason, because it doesn't function in that market. And what everything we're trying to do is actually put it in the market by, inclusionary zoning, funding, tax credit, public land. They're the only tools we have at our disposal to try and operate in that market. But we're not playing in that market until we use those tools. Anyway, hope that explains it.
Understand how the state continues to intensify these unfunded mandates, where, again, taking away the redevelopment funds with the new budget, not putting in affordable, but creating an agency that will watch and punish cities. And so my question circles back to, and it's not a fair question to ask you, so if you choose not to, I'll understand, but is it an error, or is it intentional to set the cities up for failure to trigger SB 35 and require the streamlining of market rate housing?
I can't say for sure. I assumed it was it wasn't malintent. I just assumed it was a misunderstanding. I think that certainly when I spoke to the people at HCD in the process, it wasn't clear to me that they understood that the DOF had added that piece of the puzzle. And you have to actually, dig into the DOF tables to really understand and read their notes on their methodology to understand that that was some thinking, that had gone into the process. And in terms of, I think Senator Wiener just recently said that he had introduced it. Sorry, I was talking about HCD, whereas it was intentional. I think that they were just following what they saw as the, intentions of SB 828. I think that Senator Wiener said that he deliberately intended, that he saw that there's a need for more housing, and so that he thought that the numbers, I guess, were incorrect in the previous cycle. I guess it would be helpful if people did stand up and say, we made the following mistakes, and this is why we were wrong, and this is how we're correcting it. That didn't happen. I think the numbers are flawed because they don't make sense when you plug them back in terms of, like, for example, the job housing ratio or housing production. And I think the HCD numbers, their former approach has been, pretty much duplicated by Freddie Mac and the work of the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard. There's a lot of consistency there. So I don't think it was intentional necessarily by the HCD. They just followed the rules. And I think Senator Wiener probably, I suspect, has good intentions, but the approach, I think just doubling the numbers for the sake of doubling the numbers is flawed, because if we want to understand that we have gotten out of this housing crisis, we can't benchmark ourselves against inflated numbers. We never sort of fully understand. And I don't think the benchmark should be, here's the housing target, how many houses have the cities built? Because it's not just building housing. It's like, what the problem we're trying to solve is socioeconomic inequity and climate change. They're the fundamental problems that we're really trying to solve. So if we don't get the right type of housing, we can build all the housing we like and still not solve that commute issue. And we're still in the same place. So, solving the right problem is so important from my perspective. And I also think that it's crazy that the cities are held accountable to these numbers, because they don't control the market at all. So they have no influence on market rate production. Yet, creating a few incentives yes, but like that's not going to really move the market. And then the 60% affordable housing, it seems very unfortunate that these housing targets have been set, but no one has supplied cities with the tools or the funding to actually achieve them. So how can you hold them accountable when they don't have the means to accomplish it? That seems like, a self-reinforcing, idea that's, meant for cities to fail. I don't know that anybody's truly thought it through. If they have, that's very Machiavellian. But I think that the cities cannot be held accountable for the targets they can't control.
Thank you.
I think that, you bring up a good point, which is that labor pool is short. I mean, there is a serious construction labor shortage in California, and actually across the country. And I think that, there's some thought, oh, well, with increased unemployment during COVID, that might be resolved. But the problem is a lot of those trades, especially trades, are not, it's not like just unskilled labor. A lot of it is skilled labor of a specific type. So there are constraints on that front. That is part of that housing capacity. How much housing can we possibly build? So that's going to be limited, which is why if we're limited, let's make it intentional what we build. In terms of what you bring up about affordable housing, it's right. It's exactly as you say. It's the reason why we can only get a little bit built, because the only way we get anything built is through inclusionary zoning. And even then it's a struggle. I mean, what people have to realize is, if you want to build affordable housing, you have to participate in the market. The real costs have to be covered. It has to be funded. And cities don't have that money in their budgets at all to build anything at scale. In fact, many of them are sort of barely hanging on as it is. The state has the wherewithal. They have the funding that could be diverted to this effort. I think the thing that I think is a shame is that they've said housing, homelessness and housing and affordable housing is their number one priority, but they haven't funded it like they actually mean it. But it would take, as I mentioned before, something like 20 to $30 billion a year dedicated funding to invest to build that affordable housing. I think that I suspect it's not going to happen. I think most of these bills that get passed, if you read the fine print, there's always a lot about the fact that, it won't be, and no cost will be come back to the state. But that it's either going to take the state to fund it, or the state to at least acknowledge that cities can't build without the funding. Sometimes I think that in the most dense areas where it is the most expensive to build, it might be more effective for the state to introduce a housing voucher program that builds on the federal housing voucher program. Because right now, because there's such a shortage of affordable housing, it's like a lottery. So some people win the lottery and get to live in affordable housing, but there's a whole lot of unfortunate people who are really barely hanging on, who are at cost burden because they didn't win that lottery. And wouldn't it be more fair if we had a housing voucher system that was more flexible, like could deal with the fluctuations in the economy? That would also be expensive, obviously expensive ticket, and would be other sorts of issues around it. But I think we probably have to think more creatively and innovatively about the solutions to the problem, because at the rate we're going, it's going to take decades to build the affordable housing. And each year we seem to need more and more of it.
What I'm understanding is that your institute publishes these numbers and they get out, and cities have noticed them. And we have some cities, maybe down Southern California, that are a little bit ahead of us in the cycle. Are your numbers and your arguments being used by other cities? And if so, how are they in the appeal period back to HCD? Are they raising these issues, and how is HCD responding? Or
I have a little bit of knowledge. I know that particularly in Southern California, the work of the Institute was cited in a number of the appeals letters. And particularly, as I said, there's a couple of groups who are not challenging their allocation from SCAG. They're challenging the source numbers from the HCD, and their appeal has not yet been heard. But they are basically using our numbers and the numbers of Freddie Mac to say that, that these numbers, it's been an erroneous double counting, and it's an erroneous process. And I think it may take, their understanding is it's going to take quite a deal of time. But the idea is that they're taking it up with SCAG to challenge HCD, and if SCAG, if that appeal sort of fails, I think that they have a whole series of other routes they're planning to pursue. But they believe they don't want to wait till till later in the process to challenge these numbers, because they think that they are set up to fail, as Julie has pointed out, and they sort of believe, I think, that there's a more intentional. And there's more intention behind it. Or that, also I think part of their argument is that that the HCD has erroneously interpreted the law.
Very invested in and have followed Gab's research for quite a while. I do want to share with everyone that there is an organization, California Alliance of Local Electeds, that is addressing this, discussing it, and it is a statewide organization of local electeds, and all local electeds here are welcome to join us. There's a great deal of discussion about how to respond to this error. And for the most part, we believe while we need to make a statement at the level of ABAG and SCAG, that's not where it's going to be effective, because they don't have the it isn't allowable within their appeals process to use that argument, and changing the methodologies will not change that HCD number, which is really the challenge. So I did want to point out that there is discussion of a legislative audit, asking the Legislative Audit Committee to audit the HCD and the error, if in fact it's an error, but the excessive abuse of power, issuing numbers without a basis of that they can justify, and their lack of response to us and to others really does call into question their ability to justify this. So I would ask everyone to contact your legislators and support a legislative audit on this. Also, there is a statewide lawsuit where a firm has already more than 50 cities interested in joining to push back on HCD on this issue if they don't correct it. So there is a strong movement to address this, and please, if anyone shares this concern, contact me. Thank you.
And I was going to add that our work, our newsletter goes out to, we have a list of every city council elected across California. We have city elected officials, the city planner and city attorney, but we don't cover everybody working for the city. If there's a particular role in the city that you think we should be sending the newsletters to, let us know as well.
All right, well, that was very informative. Thank you, Gab. And we'll probably be following up with you. And so thank you for attending. Thank you for the information. There will be an appeal period at HCD for the RHNA numbers and methodology that will be basically the second half of this year. So by the end of this year, right, end of December 21, there will be final RHNA numbers issued by HCD. And then, of course, all our housing elements are due to the state by the first month, January of 2023. And so I guess at this point, I'll open it up if anybody wants to discuss where they are or have questions about where other cities are and how we're proceeding. Please.